Thank you so much, Madison. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to this February climate conversation, talking about winter weather in Minnesota. No doubt that is something that's been on the top of minds for all of us, especially for the past couple of weeks. So we've got a timely topic for you today. My name is Julie McDonald. I work for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program. And I would like to extend a thanks right now to Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program and the NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, which really enabled us to get the climate conversations off the ground and delivered to all of you about 5 years ago now. So we've been going for a while. Also involved in this group currently, we've got Madison at Minnesota Sea Grant, Natalie at Wisconsin Sea Grant, Kristen at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and Hillary at 1854 Treaty Authority. So we are grateful to all the partners for sharing with you these climate conversations. I just want to briefly mention the mission of our, what we call the Twin Ports Climate Conversations. We review these annually and want to ensure that we're delivering what we say, what we set out to do. We are doing this to aid in improving climate communication skills for all. We want to improve climate change related data collection and sharing in our region, motivate and support community-based adaptation. We want to increase climate change conversation in more sectors and broaden the impact of the information. And last but not least is to include and consider climate justice in each of the climate conversations. I do invite all of you to consider the mission of the climate conversations and contribute to our collective ideas and efforts as we work together toward community resilience for the Western Lake Superior region. Our presenter today, Mr. Peter Boulay of the Minnesota State Climatology Office, has had a lifetime interest and practice of observing weather, collecting data, and reporting results. Pete is a tremendous asset to the state of Minnesota and for all of us with his 23 years of public service. His passion, his longevity in the field, and institutional knowledge supports the excellent work of the Minnesota State Climatology Office. I encourage you all to review the climate trends tool on the DNR website. I will put that link in the chat box in a little bit. And there are all kinds of resources offered there as well. The State Climatology Office is a resource for all Minnesotans, and you are encouraged to tap into that assistance. I will also mention that recordings of previous climate conversations and our upcoming schedule can be found on the Minnesota Sea Grant website. The link to that page will be posted in the chat box as well. And also invite you to submit questions through the chat box at any time. And we will have time at the end of this presentation for questions and discussions with Pete. Just a reminder that this webinar is recorded and those recordings are posted on the Sea Grant page. And we've got a poll. How are you seeing climate change impact winter? This poll will be open throughout the presentation. And there should be a link in the chat box so you don't have to type it all in. And with that, I want to hand over the presentation to Mr. Pete Boulay. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Julie. I should always have you introduce me. That was really good. Thank you for all the kind words, for sure. And I'm happy to be here, happy to help out. And I'm going to get my slides going here. Hang on a second, make sure it's going to work.
No problem. Take your time.
Yep. Let's see. Hopefully that worked.
It looks great, Pete.
All right, great. I passed the first test, actually getting it to work, so that's good. So my talk today a little bit on Minnesota climate, especially in the winter. And I have to admit, when I first said I was going to do this talk, I thought winter was pretty much over. And boy, was I wrong. Just in the past 2 weeks, how much winter can you pack into a season? I guess we found out this year. This is a picture of Lake Superior, one of my favorite places to visit. Every chance I get up there to take a peek at it. This is February 9th, 2021. The reason why I chose this particular picture, if you're watching the news, there was about 30 ice anglers stranded on an ice floe that's separated from the main ice in Duluth, and you can see that in the corner of the picture there. That gap was the gap that was created by that the wind pushing that ice floe out, and thankfully they're all rescued. But just shows that, as we say in the DNR, ice is never completely safe. So moving on to the next slide here. So a little bit about me. I've been watching weather a long time. I always loved science. Math was always a bit of a struggle for me. I got my taste of weather in Scouts with the Weather Merit Badge, and I went to Century College in White Bear Lake, and then wound up going to St. Cloud State University, the only place in Minnesota that offers meteorology as a bachelor degree. And I worked in the private sector for a while with a place called Weather Eye Incorporated, and also Cavoris, where we made weather maps and forecasted all over the world. And then I joined the DNR State Climatology Office, like Julie mentioned, back in '98, and always had an interest in weather history, and I'm always excited for the next storm. Of course, weather's always interesting to me ever since I was a kid. And as you can see in Halloween, you get more candy if you make your own costume. That's what I discovered early on. So what has happened so far in Minnesota? What is currently happening? What could happen in the future? And of course, there'll always be variability. And this winter is a case study of variability. You can have a non-winter to a winter in real quick. And this picture there, this winter is kind of reminding me of 2019. In 2019, we're going through January, first half of the month, and really nothing was going on weather-wise. And all of a sudden, winter kicked in, and all kinds of havoc was happened in Minnesota. And this is a picture of my Target on February 14th, 2019. And people, of course, what do they buy? All the bread, all the milk, and everything else. So we had a really Arctic outbreak in late January, early February 2019, and we have the same thing going on right now. So what are we seeing so far with the climate? So what are we seeing in general is it's become wetter. We're seeing more precipitation, more snow, and more frequent and larger extremes. We've already observed this, and this is projected to continue with, of course, that word again, variability. And we're seeing increasing temperatures, especially at night, during winter, and when it's really cold. So we call it cold weather warming. And cold extremes, believe it or not, are already less common and less severe. And we had a really wet period in 2019. And we're still kind of drawing from the bank of the moisture from that too. 2019 was the wettest year on record in the Twin Cities and the entire state, going back to the 1870s and 1895. And it was also the wettest 5, 6, and 7 year period on record. And we've never recorded accumulated surpluses like this. So we just haven't had that much precipitation. 2019 was kind of the pinnacle of it. Here's Minnesota annual precipitation going back to 1895 to 2020, and that little circle dot there is last year, or 2019. 2020 is actually that dot farther down, and it was a fairly dry year, probably the driest year we've had since 2012. So and so 2019 is really wet, and it kind of followed the pattern that we've seen in the 2010s. The average annual precipitation in days with an inch or more in the Twin Cities has been going up over time, especially since the 1970s. Every decade has been fairly wet. 2000s went down a little bit, and then 2010s is wetter than anything we've seen before. Looks like we have that something on my screen. I bet you everybody's seeing that too. Please move this window away. So I don't know if I can get rid of that or not, but I'm not sure if I can do that. I'm going to try though. If everybody can bear with me for a second. Maybe I can't. Might have to just go through it. So I'm going to try this one more time. Apologize to everybody here.
That's okay, Pete.
Yeah, I had a feeling that was going to happen. And let's see, I'm going to try this method.
Or we could just go this through right
Yeah,
here.
let's see. I'm going to do this, try this here. Let me try this. Oh, still
beginning there.
Still doing it though. Okay, I'm gonna fast forward and just. So maybe we'll have to do. Could you guys use it from your point of view there, and I'll just kind of.
Yeah, Pete, I'll get it pulled up. Just a second.
Okay.
Okay, what slide are you on, Pete? So Madison can begin there.
That's a great question. Let's see. I'll fast forward here. So we'll start right here with the winter precept, slide 8. Okay. Let's try that.
All right, technical difficulties being managed.
All right.
There we go.
That looks great. Okay. So now what we're going to talk about is winter precipitation. And this is something we've been doing more often, at least at my house, is roof raking. So, and that's become more common because we've been seeing more snow. Next slide, please. So Duluth has a long weather history record, but there's some problems with Duluth. Here's the downtown Duluth in 1870. Records begin in October 1870. And where's the lake walk? I always ask, there's no real official lake walk back then. The lake was right there. So it was pretty much right next to downtown Duluth. So the initial records for Duluth start right near the lake. Next slide. So what happens is actually back then it was the Weather Bureau, they moved their offices up the hill in 1904. And they probably had some of the best views in town there. But every time you move farther away from the lake, it's a different climate. So it's hard to compare Duluth weather from 1870 to the present. Next slide, Madison. And they moved to the airport in June of 1941. So a lot of records for Duluth start from basically the 1940s, and so you're not comparing apples to oranges. So this is a picture of the airport, 1964, 65, and a lot of snow back then. And so what's happening over time, and this is records since it was moved to the airport, liquid precipitation is increasing during winter. So what's happening is during the winter, we're seeing more precipitation in Duluth. And what's happening, and also we're getting precipitation when there's in the liquid form as well. We're getting more snow and also getting more liquid precipitation in Duluth. Let's go to the next slide there. Okay. And what's happening also is the snow depth is declining in Duluth. So this is something we've seen throughout Minnesota is we're losing is the deep snowpack. And this year is the same kind of example as the lack of the deep snow cover in the state. We do have snow out there, absolutely. But do we have deep snow cover out there? A little hard to come by. It's just enough you can still play in the snow this year, but the deep snowpack is missing. So what's happened like this season is we got snow early, but it kept melting, and then we finally got cold enough to keep it. But over time, what we're seeing in the 2010s is a decline of the deep snowpack. We're still getting a lot of snow, but having deep snow just isn't around these days like it used to be. So talk a little bit about winter temperatures. This is always kind of a fun picture to take when you can get it. See some sun dogs and a halo around the sun. Because that's caused by ice crystals floating in the air. So if you're lucky this year, you got a chance to see some of this. So what's happening is over time, It's getting warmer. And of course, we'll first look at the annual average here. So this is something we've known with climate change for a very long time. As you go farther north, the temperature change increases. So southern Minnesota is a big difference to northern Minnesota. A lot more of an increase in the north and the south. Looking at the winter, you'll see that it's even more pronounced. 7 degrees in the north, 4.7 in the south. And this is one reason is because of the lack of snow cover. You've got to have a long duration of snow cover. Snow cover makes a huge difference in temperature. You have a snow cover, any heat you have radiates off into space, and you have the potential of getting much colder if there's a lot of snow. If you don't have that snow, you stay warm. If we look at the summer highs, it's not as much of a change. Really in southern and central Minnesota, it hasn't changed a whole lot. It has changed a little bit in the north though. So this is a fun graph to look at. If you take Minnesota average temperature and precipitation and put it together on a graph, so what we have is annual temperature on the bottom, so it gets warmer as you go to the right, and annual precipitation on the left side, it gets wetter as you go up. So the squares are squares from 1987 through 2020. And you'll see on that plot, we have more often warmer and wetter conditions than we have in earlier years, 1895 to 1986. And then one more I'll highlight here, the next slide, is this is what happened in 2020. So we did finish a little bit drier across the state. 2019 is that cube way up there at the top. So in general, we've seen more warmer, wetter years. So looking at just winter minimum temperatures from 1896 through 2020, there's a gradual increase over time of average winter minimum temperatures. And this last dot there is 2020. We don't have 2021 yet. We still got some winter to go. But over time, it's been going up about a half a degree a decade. So overall for the winter, it's just this gradual increase. And it's and we have more of these. Next slide. This is really part of this one, kind of highlighting the last 30 years or so. A lot more of these, I don't want to say non-winters, but very balmy, mild winters. Next part of the slide. So what was uncommon back in the 1930s is fairly common today. So winters just don't get as cold as they used to. I know we're in a really cold, it seems like it's cold winter this year, but really this graph is actually updated through this morning. So this is including the 2021 winter. This is comparing downtown Minneapolis, which does have a heat island, of course, and St. Cloud, which the St. Cloud airport is pretty far away from town already, and there's not any much of a St. Cloud heat island at all. And what you see on this chart is that over time, the airport, Twin Cities Airport, used to get down to -20 just about every winter, and occasionally a -30. St. Cloud, on the other hand, got down to -30 very common, and even a -40 once in a while. And then modern decades just don't see the cold. Even with this Arctic outbreak we're seeing, we never even hit -20 in the Twin Cities, and St. Cloud didn't hit -30 either. Next part of the slide, kind of highlighting the last couple of decades there. That's the kind of weather pattern we're seeing in the winter, and there are consequences for not getting as cold. Next slide. So what is the consequence? A loss of extreme winter cold. So here is something that's kind of a bane in my garden. These Japanese beetles, and they will cause you to have problems with your raspberries, beans, and other plants. Here's a picture I took. They were munching on a Virginia creeper. And so what do we need to knock these things down? You need to have temperatures of 32 degrees in the soil for 2 months to kill the grubs. And this is something I showed this picture about 15 years ago to Chisago County, and they had no idea what these were. And I did another talk just a couple of years ago, showed them these, and they knew exactly what they were. So these critters have been spreading throughout Minnesota over the last 20 years. And you don't want them in your garden, trust me. They will cause a bad day for you. Next part of the slide. So what about this year? On December 17th, we have a weather observatory at the U of M. The temperature dropped below 32 degrees for the first time at 2 inches under sod. And we're almost coming up to that 2 months. So fingers crossed, might kill off a few of these things. Also, emerald ash borer has been in the news in the last quite a few years now. And that's kind of a similar but more extreme lethal temperature to kill them off too. So the colder you get, the slowing down of these invasive species you can get. So you don't want emerald ash borer coming to town. The colder it gets, the better you get at killing these things off. And you got to cool that tree for emerald ash borer too. So the longer you're cold matters. Next slide. So here's kind of a topic I always like to discuss. This is Lake Superior ice. I had the chance to be on the North Shore back in 2014 and May 14th, still some icebergs floating around out there. It was a late ice season up there, and it could get even later than that. Next slide. So up in Duluth, there's log books held in the library up there at the college up there, and I took a look at these logbooks, and we had some weather data donated to us from the Duluth National Weather Service. They had all these old, wonderful reports, and I was able to comb through them a bit. And what I really want to know is, what was Lake Superior ice in the long, long time ago in the 19th century? Next part of the slide. So there's always been a keen interest. Obviously, Duluth is tied to that lake, and boats, of course, and nobody wants their boats stuck in the ice. So they've always had a keen interest on ice coverage. Next part. So we looked at these old observations, and of course, they're limited. There was no satellites taking pictures of the lake back in the 1800s. So they were somewhat limited in what kind of data. There's a really good report in 1899 talks about ice on Lake Superior, and a lot of the tales people would tell about the ice in Superior. Next part. In that report, they mention all these years with substantial ice. Now, when I mean substantial ice, usually what they're talking about is they can't see past the ice field in Duluth or up the North Shore or even on the Keweenaw Peninsula. So we're talking probably, easily 50, 60 miles of ice. In some years, they note 100 miles of ice. I highlighted some special years there because something noteworthy happened in each of those years in the distant past. In 1857, wolves showed up at Eagle River on the Keweenaw Peninsula, and everybody wondered where they come from. And they are guessing at the time they came from the North Shore, crossing the lake to get to Michigan using the ice. 1875, there was a tale of 5 people that walked from Isle Royale to Eagle River, and there's some not quite sure if that's authentic or not, but that was the tale that was told then. That would be a heck of a walk. I've taken a boat trip from Isle Royale to Keweenaw Peninsula, and you can see in the middle there both the peninsula and Isle Royale, but it would be a spooky walk, I would think, in the winter. In 1876, the last one I highlighted there is when people in Duluth made ice cream on July 4th from the remnants of the ice still in Superior. So I don't know if they'd want to do that every year for July 4th, but it was a big deal in 1876. So there's some other years there, and probably more after 1922, but that's about when the report stopped, when I was looking at. Next slide. Luckily for us, we now have satellites. And since 1973, we have a much better idea on the coverage of Lake Superior. Before there were satellites, it was always hard to tell exactly what percentage of the lake would be covered. The last part of the lake that usually freezes is the part, kind of the eastern part of the lake. There's usually a kind of like an oval shaped area of open water. It's the last to freeze. And a few times in the past, it has frozen almost 100%. Next slide. Kind of highlight that one right there. About 1996 was probably the maximum coverage. 1979 might be a close second, where it was nearly 100% covered. What's interesting from that report from 1899, they doubted Superior ever froze over completely. So that would be something for future research, is maybe digging in a bit more and see, is there more data on Superior ice? Next slide. And of course, for 2021, what's going to happen this year? Big question mark. Let's take a look. Next slide. So here we were, I was starting these slides, and it looked like we might have a record low ice cover for Superior. So this is not that long ago, February the 4th, 3.8% coverage. Next slide. Here's what it was this morning, up to 33% coverage. So out of nowhere, once we had the right conditions, Superior started to freeze. Next slide. So here's the trend for the year so far, for the season. And you can see we made up a lot of ground, but we're still not quite up to the average ice concentration compared to the current year. In the last couple of decades, we have seen in general lower ice concentration in Superior, but there's also been extreme variability as well. Next slide. So something I kind of came up with to try to get a handle on how mild or extreme a winter is, I came up with the snow and cold index. This is for the Twin Cities. The problem with doing this for Duluth is you could only really do it after the move to the airport, because you're moving it away from the lake. Of course, you're going to be colder. You're going to see more snow. So I'll show something for Duluth in a minute too, but for the Twin Cities, this is the current one for this year, and we had a bit of a slow start. It's hard to remember now, but both December and January were well above normal. And so we didn't get much for cold points in this winter. All the cold points we're getting is basically in the last 2 weeks. Next slide. So part of my kind of the take-home message is expect variability. You know, we are warming, but we also can still get cold, and it's some noteworthy cold too. And this is kind of a tale of two winters, just like almost like this winter. You know, back in 2019, January 17th, snow depth was 0. Looked like we were in the clear. Winter was about over. And then February 14th, we have a foot of snow on the ground. Now, we might not as much snow on the ground this year, but we have certainly the cold to contend with. Next slide. So on my snow and cold index, here is 1819, way up there in the severe winter. So it didn't take, once you got the winter going, you can make up for some lost ground. Next slide. What about a bigger winter? Everybody might remember the big long winter of 2013-14. This is 207 points on the index. Next slide. You can see where that is. And that's where that was. That was the most extreme winter we had in the state for many years. In the Twin Cities, we had over 50 nights of below 0, which is something I'm not sure we were going to see again. And all throughout the state, it was definitely a memorable long winter. Next slide. So for Duluth, you could look it up too. They have the same kind of snow and cold index. They call it the Accumulated Winter Season Severity Index, or AUSSI, for Duluth. And it matches about basically the same kind of winter we're seeing so far. A very sluggish start. Well, actually, at first we had some snow, so we kind of got a little boost. But then, you know, not much cold, so it just moved into the average range for winters now. So when it's all said and done, this winter might just wind up being average. So we'll have to see, though. Of course, there is March and there is April to go through still. Next slide. So what about the future? Well, let's talk a little bit about what could happen in the future. So this is a newspaper article. Next slide, part of the slide is from February 1899 headline, but it could be this year too. It's been some of the coldest February weather we've seen in a long time. One thing that stands out with this Arctic outbreak is how late it's been. You know, we usually don't get these Arctic outbreaks this late in February. The sun is starting to get pretty strong, and it's hard to believe in about 3 weeks it'll be daylight savings time. So it's late for an outbreak, but we have had some of these in the past. Next slide. Well, I got to have some warm thoughts so we can warm up here. So I took a look at the Climate Prediction Center's outlook in 8 to 14 days. This is for the last week of February to March 1st. And the eastern half of the country has a tendency for above normal temperatures. So, you know, we're getting, at least in southern Minnesota, getting near closer and closer to freezing for a high temperature. So we're getting to the point where we might actually start melting snow again. Next slide. How about precipitation? So looks like normal, and then maybe even for the tip of Minnesota above normal precipitation. So If we're a little warm and normal or above normal precipitation, we might move back into some snow. It's been a while since we've had some significant snow in the state, so we'll have to see what happens there. Next slide. How about more in the future? February through April, looks like we'll have some warmer conditions if this comes true. I have to say the Climate Prediction Center's track record of anything longer than 8 to 14 days isn't always that great. Sometimes it's not much better than a coin toss, and sometimes the coin would win. But if this comes true, maybe we'll have an early spring. We'll see. Next slide. How about precipitation? Looks like either equal chances or above normal precipitation coming into the spring. So, and this is actually a good thing because we right now have a dry spell going on in the state. The entire state's under some kind of drought designation. And in fact, there's especially northeast Minnesota, it's well short of normal. Duluth had a very dry 2020. So some springtime precipitation would probably be welcome. Whether or not you want it in the liquid or solid form, I'll leave that up to you. Next slide. Something else that's coming up this year, we have the new normals that'll be coming out. Every 10 years, averages are recalculated and they call them the normals. And every 10 years, that's what when you watch in the news or the National Weather Service, when they compare what's going on right now to the normal. And these will be changing with the new data, 1991 through 2020. Next slide, part of the slide. It'll become operational in May. So what will happen is when you see temperatures or precipitation compared to normal, it'll no longer be the 1981 through 2010 normals. It'll be the new ones. What does that mean? Next part of the slide. Duluth in the new normals are wetter, more snow, and likely warmer. We're not quite sure on the warmth yet. We can calculate the precipitation and snow right now, but the temperature normals, there requires a little bit more math and a little bit more comparing observation changes and such. So you don't know exactly what's going on at the new normals, but most likely warmer, especially overnight in the winter. Next part of the slide. So the annual normal goes up by 0.39 of an inch of precipitation. June will still be the wettest month in Duluth. January will now be the driest month. Next slide, or part of the slide. December is going to replace January as the snowiest month. This is the case not only in Duluth, but also in other places in Minnesota. And the average snowfall goes up too by a couple of inches compared to what the old normal was. So what this means is, with it being wetter and snowier, you might run into more below normal snow and precipitation if you compare it to the new normals compared to the old. So there'll be a lot more information on these new normals coming out, and check back with the Weather Service or on our DNR State Climatology website. We'll have all kinds of information probably up by this summer. But just to know in back of your mind, something new is coming down the pipe. And then after that, the summary. Winters warmer and wetter, more snow, but we don't have as much of the prolonged snow depth. And the lack of severe cold can cause harmful pests to survive. And that's something, maybe with this cold spell, be long enough to knock things back a bit. And that'll be good if you like to grow things in your garden. And we were saving money on heating. I don't know about the last 2 weeks, but in general, with colder, not as cold overall in the winter, I mean, December, January, we've certainly saved money on heating, and maybe not on snow removal though. But one good thing about this winter that I heard in December, January, there was enough snow to play in, but it wasn't that cold. So winter recreation wasn't too bad. Of course, the last 2 weeks is a little tough to get outside, but I did hear from somebody this morning that was snowmobiling when it was 44 below zero in Big Fork. So if you're determined enough and dressed enough, you can still enjoy the weather no matter what the winter throws at you. And with that, if anybody, last slide, any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions people have, or I'll try to at least.
Great. Thanks, Pete, so much for your presentation. As a reminder for folks, if you have questions, you can type those in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute to ask your question, I believe you can raise your hand if you click on the reactions button at the bottom. There should be a way to raise your hand, so feel free to do that. Before we switch into questions, I just want to quickly share the results of our two poll questions that we asked. So if I could share my screen, sorry if this is a little clunky. I'll just do that really quick and then so folks can see. Can folks see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so for your favorite winter activity, no surprise here. Skiing was our top response, followed by lots of other activities, photography, skating, hiking, camping. So thanks for sharing those. Of course, we have lots of winter outdoor recreation enthusiasts. And then the next question was just, how are you seeing climate change impact winter already? So folks mentioned things like unpredictable weather, which Pete, I think that ties right into your presentation, shorter season, warmer temperatures, less snow and ice, fewer really cold days, extreme temperature swings, downhill skiing has been impacted, more extreme weather events and flooding. So thanks so much everyone for your responses. And then in closing, we have one more question. And it's just what additional information about climate change and weather or in winter you'd like to know about. And so we'll leave that open for the rest of the meeting. So yeah, okay, I'm gonna stop sharing so we can go back to the questions. Okay, and I'll jump into the chat here. So we have a question, Pete, from Shelly.
Okay.
And it's she's curious about what you think drought conditions will look like this year, especially for Northwest Minnesota. And how that might influence fire conditions for prescribed burns and wildfires.
Absolutely. Well, the majority of fires happen in the spring before green up. And one thing I'm concerned about is the lack of snow cover in northwestern Minnesota. So while that's good for people that are tired of seeing spring flooding, it could mean an impact on the spring fire conditions up there. And it's hard to say what would happen. We started moving into this drought in 2020, and it was kind of a veneer because we were so wet in 2019. It kind of masked the effect of the drought. We kept looking for drought signs, and it was difficult because it's so wet. 2019 lakes were elevated, streams were elevated, and things like that. Yeah, I would be concerned this year in the spring, especially if we don't get any more snow. We could have an open ground sooner up in northwest Minnesota. Absolutely. So it's definitely something I'd be concerned about. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, then we have a question from Julie. Can we expect increased polar vortices, I think that's the plural, in Minnesota in future years?
We've always had a polar vortex around. It's just how much of a piece do we get this far south? So I always watch them because they're usually up in Canada moving around, well to the north of us. And then we get a lobe of it. And sometimes the polar vortex goes all the way down to Texas, which is what's happening right now. And I don't know about increased polar vortex. That's a good question. That I might have to get back on that one and ask Kenny Blumenfeld on what his opinion would that be on that one too. I think we'll always have a polar vortex potential in every winter. It seems like every winter we get at least one of these kind of outbreaks. Now they're all a little bit different, and perhaps we won't get them as intense. We didn't get down to -20 here. St. Cloud didn't get to -30. And that's something, that's a signature of a polar vortex is how cold is your maximum cold. And we're just not getting those maximum colds. We looked at Grand Rapids too, same thing. Trend of maximum cold is going down. Milan, a small town in west central Minnesota, same kind of pattern. Just don't have that extreme cold, but we will still have some cold.
Great. Right along those lines, how will more frequent cold spells like this one play into the average? Will it since it's getting warmer for longer, will they make a difference?
That's a good and that's a great question, because if you look at this winter, when it's all said and done in the distant future, meteorological winter is December, January, February. Okay, if you looked at this winter in the future, what's it going to show? It was average. Because December warm, about 5 degrees above normal, January about 5-6 degrees above normal, and then February is going to be way below normal, maybe 10 degrees below normal the way we're going. So you average those three together, it's average. Well, that's not the whole story, obviously, right? So it will play into it. And this, if we just have these, this is a pretty short-lived cold spell so far. I'll knock on wood because obviously we're not in March yet, but you know, this winter said and done, it's not going to look that outstanding in the future. Although if you looked at the last 2 weeks, it shows up. But you know, if we get enough of these, it might tilt it a little bit below normal. But in general, we're still seeing warmer than normal winters. We just aren't long enough cold spells to tilt it cold.
Great. Okay, then we have a comment and kind of a related question that I'll try to summarize. It seems like the use of climate normals leads us to hide how climate is changing. Because the normals change every decade, the warming wetness gets baked in so that our changing conditions don't look that different from the new normal. And the question that came out of that, and maybe you can comment about that initial comment too, is there any chance that NOAA will change to a different model that does not mask climate change?
Ooh, that's a great question, and something climatologists have debated forever is what is normal, right? And long ago, over 100 years ago, they came together and said, this is what we're going to define normal. It's a 30-year period that's calculated every 10 years. Well, the math was a pretty laborious back then. Now it's a lot easier. So there's been plans afoot to change how you do the normal. Should we redo it every year? Should we do it longer? So, and there was a lot, when they changed the normals 10 years ago, we were all ready for it to compare the old normals, to the ones that we're just still in right now. And they said you couldn't do it because we changed the math of how to calculate the temperature. So we were all very sad because we wanted to compare one normal to the next as you go in the future. So yes, that is a concern with the normal. That's why you want to look at as long of a period of record as you can to really get a good handle on what's happening long term. And for Minnesota, you need at least 100 years of data, preferably as much as you can get, because you really start seeing long-term patterns there. Normal is useful to compare what's going on today. It's not necessarily always the best barometer for climate change in general.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a question from Jan. Do El Nino and La Nina in the Pacific impact polar vortices or other Minnesota weather?
Absolutely. We see El Nino impacts, especially in the winter here. And one thing that's a problem for us here, we're so far away from the ocean. I always like, you take a boulder, you throw it into a lake, a still lake, and you see the ripples. And right near where you threw the boulder in, huge waves, right? As you get farther and farther away, the ripples get smaller and smaller. For people like in California, Washington, and Oregon, El Nino and La Nina, huge impacts, big changes in weather. As we get over here in Minnesota, it gets diffused. We're far away from the ocean. So we see more of a temperature impact than a precipitation impact with El Nino and La Nina. Usually El Nino would mean we'd have a warmer winter. It shifts that jet stream farther north is what El Nino would do because of the warming of the Pacific. So it does impact polar vortex where it will be placed. On the face of it, you'd think El Nino, you'd have less chance of a polar vortex than a La Nina. La Nina, you have a better chance, especially as you go farther into like North Dakota. So they do have an impact on our weather. It's not a for sure thing. We've had some cold winters with El Nino. We've had some warm winters with La Nina. So it's never 100% for sure thing. I wish it was. It'd be easier to predict the weather.
Great, thanks. Okay, our next question is from Justin. First, just saying great presentation. And then have you observed any data trends, either an increase or decrease in snow water equivalent values from past winters to the present across the state?
Yep, and that's something I do too, is I take a rain gauge and stick it in the ground and melt the snow. I don't know if there's been, I gotta think for this for a minute. The biggest problem we have with snow water equivalent is you got to keep the snowpack. And if we're not keeping the snowpack, we're not keeping as much water in the landscape. So you would think if we don't have as deep a snow, we'd have less snow water equivalent. But we also are seeing more precipitation in general in the winters too. So while we might not have as much snow, we might still have just as much water in the landscape. You know, we're looking for flooding. You start getting interested in the snow water equivalent. It gets about 4 inches of liquid in the snowpack. And then like in the Red River Valley, if it's getting up about 6 inches, then, you know, the red flags go up. North Shore is completely different critter. You could have a lot of water in that snow. Luckily, it's fairly close to where it has to wind up down the North Shore there. So it's a little different scenario up on the North Shore. You can have a lot more water there, but for its flooding like Minnesota, Mississippi, Red River, watch it every year. I'm not exactly sure on the trends of snow water equivalent. That's reliant on volunteers doing it. And so a person has to go out to do it. So I don't know how much data we have from people doing it, but that I'm definitely going to pass that one along. That's a good one to look into. That's a good one.
Great. Along those lines, Julie asked a question. Do you feel there are enough precipitation monitoring stations in northern Minnesota?
Luckily, we have a network of rain gauge readers out there that the soil and water conservation districts run. And they do an excellent job recruiting and keeping people interested. And in Northeast Minnesota, there's a lot of weather to look at. So, and a lot of snow to measure. So our biggest problem is, of course, more people live in the Northeast within a mile of Highway 61. Once you get away from 61 up over the hill, there are a lot less people. So that's where we could use more precipitation monitoring folks away from the lake, really. So that's one place we could use, especially closer to the boundary waters. You know, there just isn't as many people there. That's part of the problem.
Sure. Those are all the questions I'm seeing in the chat. If anyone would like to raise their hand and unmute and ask a question, feel free to do that.
Did you happen to cover that one from, let's see, Erica Johnston about any chance that NOAA might change to a different model?
Yes, we did. We did
Okay.
cover that one.
I heard you. Okay.
Okay. Shelly has a question. How does one become a weather monitor? Oh, you might be muted.
Yeah, Pete, you're muted.
Now I'm on. You hear me now? Okay. All right. I'm going to paste in the chat one way people can become a weather monitor. There's a nationwide program called COCORAS, and people could become a weather monitor through that. And that's an easy way to do it. Also through the soil and water conservation districts is also possible too. But send me an email if you're curious about that, and then I could see if they need anybody in your area. COCORAS, it's a good way to read up on it and give you a good idea. Yeah, it's a good rain gauge to get. It's the one I've had since I was a kid, and you can measure precip to 1/100 of an inch, and it'll last you 10 years if you treat it right.
Yeah, and I think I've seen something from the Duluth Weather Service about signing up to be a weather spotter. I don't know if that's exactly the same thing, but folks might be interested in that as well. Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions. There are some great comments and coming in through the poll too, asking about things like growing season impacts.
Oh, yes.
We might need to save that for another presentation for another
That's a good one.
Session, but there's also questions about kind of wildlife impacts from climate change, and then kind of the interactions between the influence of climate change on Lake Superior and how that also influences the regional climate. So I don't know if you have any comments about any of those.
The growing season is interesting. I've talked to people that like to grow ornamentals and you know, you always want to you ever notice when they sell things in the stores, they always kind of push the growing zone a little bit, you know, what zone are you in? And you know, and when they redo, the USDA redoes the maps every so often, it's interesting to see how much that changes. But the bottom line is, if you grow roses, you're always going to have to keep really in tune to the weather. So, you know, you'll still get nipped on occasion if you're, you know, you're growing things out there. I'm trying with my Lake Superior. You know, that's a good question too. I don't have a good handle on, you know, what's the future hold for Superior. You know, I think there's a lot more research to be done on that too. You know, understanding the water balance. You know, we had really low water levels, and then we had really high water levels. I mean, there's a lot going on. That would be a whole nother talk, I think.
Yeah, we'll save that for next time.
Yeah.
Okay, I think those are all the questions and comments that we've gotten. So if we wrap up a little early, I think that's okay. Let me just make sure I remember everything. Of course, thank you, Pete, so much for presenting today. It was a really great presentation and great discussion. We really appreciate you taking the time for our Twin Ports climate conversation. As a reminder for everyone, if you'd like to sign up for the listserv and Sea Grant website, those links are in the chat. And if you visit the website, you might notice that it looks a little different. The old URL will work for now, but make sure you update it to the new Minnesota Sea Grant page. Next month, our TPCC will be March 16th from noon to 1. We're going to continue our theme of winter, and I'll be presenting an update from the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts. And then Hillary will also be presenting some stories from north of here. So with that, I think we'll wrap up, and thanks everyone again for joining us today and for being here and for a great discussion.